So just recently I took my wife and a few of my family members, a couple of daughters and some grandchildren, son-in-law, and spent some time in Hawaii at a timeshare unit that we have over there. And it was an interesting experience because I started to, this isn't the first time I've gone over, and I don't know what sponsored me to get that to begin with, what prompted that thought, but it's been interesting. It's not something that I would normally do, and yet there's been some good things happen because of it, even though that's been expensive. And I found myself the first few times we went over wanting to make sure that I went here and did that and saw this and saw that and kind of took in all the touristy things. Anyway, this trip, somebody asked me what was the best part of the trip after I got back. And I honestly told them what it was, and this is what it was. Sitting on the deck and talking to my grandson and my granddaughter. It's amazing what we do to try to put ourselves in a position to just slow down. It's, I say we're, but maybe it's just me, but I'm thinking not. We try to create a good situation, and we don't see what a good situation is when it's staring us right in the face. We think we've got to hurry all the time. We think we've got to get here and get there. You don't actually have the time to sit down on the deck and have a good long talk with Grandpa. You know, maybe it's not that exciting, I admit. But once you get engaged in a good conversation, most of my grandchildren that have taken it to that level kind of said they'd like to do it again sometime. So it's made me think, as I come back from that vacation, that maybe I ought to reconsider what's the best way to accomplish the goal. I've told my wife that I need to sell the timeshare and be done with it. And she says, no, we can let somebody use it or rent it off or something, which I guess we can. It's not like we have to use it. And not that it's even costing us anything if we rent it out or whatever. But it's been interesting, to me at least, because the best times for me are, it's not even sitting on the beach and soaking in the sun anymore. It's because because of the waves on the ocean, you can't hear conversation. But for some reason, sitting on the deck, even in the dark at night, visiting with a grandson that has some questions and wants to hear what you have to say about some things, and you listen to what he's been thinking and try to evaluate him. And sometimes he'll ask you questions, and sometimes I'll ask him questions. We just come to a better understanding of things that way. It's unfortunate that I haven't been able to do that with more of my grandchildren. A lot of it's my own fault, I realize that. But to me, that's the essence of a good vacation. And it doesn't cost a lot of money if we just do it. It doesn't even have to be a deck. It can be a lawn somewhere. It can be down at the park. can be over a picnic table. We go the long way around. I think I've told you the story about where I was raised. There's this, I know I've said this in one of the videos, but there was this house that we called it Willis's house, and it was down toward the lake, 20-mile long lake, and there was a little side chute off to Willis's house. The old saying was there that when you took the wrong route to get to your destination, it was like you went around the lake to get to Willis's. Getting to Willis's would have only taken you 15 minutes. Going around the lake takes you 2 hours and 15 minutes. So that's what the old term going around the lake to get to Willis's meant. And I think as it pertains to quality time that you might consider for a vacation, sometimes, especially with me anyway, I go around the lake to get to Willis's. It's not that complicated to have some enjoyment. All right, well, what Thoreau have to say about that? We've been talking about him a little bit, but he actually did have something to say about it. And it kind of ties in with some things that have been going on in the news lately. He said, I would rather sit on a pumpkin and have it all to myself than be crowded on a velvet cushion. I might say, I'd rather sit on the deck with my grandson and have it all to ourselves than be crowded on the beach. So, anyway, think about that and ask yourself if you would rather sit on a pumpkin and have it all to yourself or be crowded on a velvet cushion. One's a lot more expensive, and if it doesn't get you where you really want to go, why spend the money and take the time? I think we misdirect our energies a lot of the time. And as far as sitting on a pumpkin and having it all to yourself, I was raised, like I said, I've been raised on a dairy farm as a kid. We didn't have close neighbors. So there was a lot of time when I was alone, but I didn't really feel alone. I'd sit and ponder something. Maybe that's where I learned this pondering thing that I do so much. But there's a lot of value that can come from it, I think. I find myself now driving through the canyon. I don't need the radio going. I can just drive, think about things as I'm driving through the canyon, and before I know it, I can turn an hour-long drive into something that seems like only 10 minutes because your mind's been engaged during that time thinking about things. And you could say, well, there's only so much you can think about, but there really isn't. There's a whole lot of things to think about. And it's kind of fun to have that privacy, sitting on your pumpkin time and thinking about it. I mentioned that it ties into the news. I don't know if you've listened to it lately, but if you haven't, there's been wildfires in the Los Angeles area. And the pictures that they show on television are just one massive destruction. You know, when you think of wildfires, you think of forests and things like that. You don't think of whole cities burning down. And yet that's exactly what's happened down there. Those wildfires burnt down whole cities, house after house after house. I forget how many thousands of structures it burned down. Killed a lot of people. I couldn't help but think about scripture in Isaiah. And I looked it up the other day. I think I've got it right here, actually. Still, here it is. This is what it says in Isaiah. So, clear back in Isaiah's day, which was like, 700 BC, something like that. That's when Isaiah lived. He said, this comes from chapter 5. Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field till there is no place, that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth. Kind of interesting that somebody back that long ago would actually throw that warning out to us that maybe we shouldn't build so doggone close to each other, house to house. That way, if one house got on fire, it wouldn't burn the whole city down, and yet that's exactly what happened in Los Angeles. Scriptures should be read and kind of listened to, I guess. Yes, in the house that I grew up in, and I was actually born in that house, there was a change from hospital to another hospital they were building in the city that was close by us, where I would normally have been born, but it wasn't operable, and they were changing, and so I was born in my house, my mother's and my dad's house, and that's probably something that's rare. You'd never think of that much these days, and even in those days, a little bit rare, because I just happened to catch a window where there wasn't a hospital available. But then you think back to the early times, and there wasn't hospitals, and babies were born in houses all the time. So those were simpler times, and they were more difficult in a lot of ways. I guess you could think of sitting on a pumpkin as being more difficult than sitting on a vacation or sitting on a velvet cushion and being crowded on it. I've enjoyed raising my children also in a rural community, one that they could feel like they could get out and go for walks. And not that you can't walk in the city. I mean, you can do that. You can go to the park or wherever and walk. But there's just something about not being around where you're hearing the hum of traffic and the sirens going off and blaring at different hours of the day and night, police cars, and then when I drive into the city or down into the city, I feel out of my element. I just feel like this isn't where I really belong. I belong in a quiet place. And I've lived in some of those quiet places, overlooking lakes and in small communities away from the main roads, and I've enjoyed every minute of it because, well, I shouldn't say every minute. There were trials there too. It's not like we didn't have trials, but it was always refreshing to me to just be able to go walking off into the fields, and I can remember some of those excursions, and they were meaningful to me. Again, maybe I'm my dad used to say that you're an odd duck, you know. Maybe I'm an odd duck. Maybe I don't quack like the rest or whatever. But I just like solitude. I would rather sit on a pumpkin and have it all to myself than be crowded on a velvet cushion. I think I agree with Thoreau, because I don't think I'd bemoan having to sit on a pumpkin as opposed to a velvet cushion. Well, anyway, those hectic times that we have in our lives when we're in crowds and all that just seem to put people on the edge. Have you ever noticed that it's in the cities? It's where the crime is the worst. And you can say, well, yeah, of course it is, because there's more people there. But I think if you look at it statistically, people in cities just get on each other's nerves after a while, and there's no way to get away from it, and they go goofy. I'll never forget, it hasn't been that long ago either, that I pulled into a parking lot and was going to walk into the store, and two people pulled in, one right after the other, into that same parking lot. And one of them got out of the other one and ran back to his car and kicked it and banged on the window. And the person on the inside rolled the window down just a little bit, and they were just cussing the worst kind of words you could possibly imagine. And I just listened for a little while, thinking they're going to kill themselves. It's a good thing they didn't have a gun or something, because I think somebody might have died right there in front of me if they'd had something to inflict some injury with. As it was just their hands and their mouths and their foot. And it went on and on for some time, and I listened just long enough to know that there'd been some sort of a road incident, call it road rage, because that's what we hear all the time on the news, right? Road rage. I got mad because you cut me off on traffic, or you didn't start when I wanted you to start after the stoplight, and I honked, and that made you mad, and you flipped me off, and this, that, and the other, and pretty soon you're so mad that you just chase them down and pull them over and threaten to do all kinds of things just because you're aggravated. Well, I think those kinds of things play out more often than we think in areas where there's dense populations. In the rural community that I grew up in, there were houses maybe a quarter to a half mile apart, each of them with a little farm of their own and a few milk cows and things like that they made their livings with. But there was no density. And it was a good feeling. When you drive down the road, there'd be some farmer clear out in the field, maybe a quarter of a mile or an eighth of a mile at least. And he'd see you and recognize the car, and he'd put out a big wave at you like he hadn't seen you for months. And it just gave you a good feeling. I can remember being with my father, and we'd be fencing or something down in the pasture. A neighbor would be mowing hay off in the fields next to us. Pretty soon, he'd shut off the equipment, come over, and they'd lean over the fence. My dad would lean over the fence the other way. They'd just visit for maybe 20, 30 minutes. Nothing really to talk about, just jabber away about something and say, how's the hay crop, or what are you thinking about what's coming around the corner as far as weather goes, or prices of milk or hay or whatever. I mean, they talk about some of those things, but the main reason they talked was just to touch base. Kind of like me and my grandson over in Hawaii. just seemed to enjoy it. And there'd have been a whole ton of people around, I wouldn't have had that talk. And there's something about just being in quiet places and less dense populations that make it more conducive, I think, to having good neighbors and good friends, good times. So I guess the thing that I'd like to convey with this, and I'll finish up here in just a minute, but there needs to be solitude. I can remember when I sold real estate, and I had a lot that I thought was just an ideal lot. A lady was looking for a place to build a house, and I showed her some different lots, and I showed her what I thought was the best one, and it kind of set up over a hill, looking over the lake, kind of down on the rest of the development. It was interesting because she had no interest in that lot at all. And she pointed her finger and she said, "I want to be right down there in the middle of all that. I would just feel so alone up here." And I thought, good grief, that's what I thought everybody wanted, but I guess not. So I realize there are those that probably take opposition to what I've been saying here tonight with all this, but really give it some thought. See if at least try the solitude package and see if that doesn't work for you. Just you being alone. And I don't feel like I'm ever really alone, because I always feel like God's looking down on me a little bit. Even when I'm just being, not all that productive, just killing a little bit of time with my thinking and my thoughts. My thoughts quite often end up going towards deity and creations, knowing that I'm a part of that. It's just a purpose for me. Let me give you just a quick example. I was, as a youngster, on a cold winter night, and I'm talking 20 below zero. I look forward to 20 below zero nights because I learned that on 20 below zero nights, if I got my little single shot 22 and a flashlight so that I could see where I was walking, I'd follow the sleigh tracks. We had a horse-drawn sleigh that we'd get hay with over at the haystack. On those 20 below zero nights, I'd give my flashlight and follow those sleigh tracks over to the haystack. You might say, well, how come you waited till it was 20 below? Because when it was 20 below, the rabbits would start moving. I guess they had to have food more urgently, and you'd always see more activity when it was cold, especially if it was a moonlit night. And I'd try to pick the moonlit nights because straight darkness wasn't all that enticing to me, and yet I grew to love even the dark nights. So what's all this got to do with what I'm talking about solitude and being alone? Time to think. I'd climb up on that haystack with my gun, and quite often there'd be snow up there because there'd be snowstorms, and I'd have to clear off a spot with my shoes, my boots. But then what I would do is I'd get my hands and start grabbing a hold of the hay, and for the first few inches it was just cold and brittle, and you didn't know if you were going to get through it. But if you kept after it and dug down, pretty soon you'd get down into the hay where you could pull it out and pile it a little bit. And long story short, I dug a hole for myself down into this top of this haystack. We just stacked it loose. We didn't bale it back in those days. And I'd wedge my way down into that haystack and pull that hay around me. And of course, I'd have a coat or something on. And the hood around my ears, or earmuffs, and try to keep my ears warm. My fingers were always seemed like getting colds. I had to be careful with those. But so there I am, speaking of solitude. I'm sitting down there on a haystack in the middle of the night. I shouldn't say the middle. It was like maybe 9 o'clock. Just give the rabbits plenty of time to get on the move, sometimes even earlier than that. But I would wedge my way down into the haystack, and especially on those moonlit nights, you'd watch, and there'd be trails of rabbits coming in. I shouldn't say trails of rabbits, but there would be trails that the rabbits would use coming into the stack. They weren't too hard to see, 2 or 3 trails coming in from different directions. And the rabbits needed the hay, and it was cold and convenient for them to come into the haystack, and I'd sit up there and wait for one. And of course, my goal was to shoot them once they got out there. It seems kind of cruel now, doesn't it? But at the time, I was just passing through that hunter stage of development, I guess, and it seemed like exciting. And besides that, my dad didn't seem to mind because they would eat the hay that the cows needed, and he didn't seem to mind anyway that I would do that. So it wasn't the shooting, because that didn't happen very often. I mean, occasionally now and then you'd see one get a shot off. Sometimes you'd be successful and sometimes not. But just sitting there, burrowed down in that hay, was a great experience. Because what would you think about? Well, you can look out there at the rabbit trail and think about, oh, it's rabbits coming in. But after a little while, they don't come in. And they usually, after you shoot one, they seem to all get the idea that they should run away and not come back. So quite often I just sit there and sit there and sit there. And so my mind, I remember this one time, started thinking, heck, I wedged my way down in here, and it's 20 below zero, and I'm not all that cold. I mean, if I had my head above and the wind was blowing, then sometimes I could feel it. But it amazed me that I could wedge my way down in a haystack like that and feel warmth. So then I remember this one time thinking, well, where'd that warmth come from? There's no heaters down there in the haystack. Well, of course, it doesn't take too much logic to think, well, it comes from your own body. Well, yeah, it does. And if you pull the hay down around your shoulders and tuck it in good, well, you can kind of trap your own body heat down there and not be that bad off. But then I asked myself, well, hold on. If it comes from my own body, then where did that heat come from? And I started thinking, well, it comes from the food I eat. If I had eggs or some chicken and meat or something, potatoes, some milk, which is quite often what we'd have for a dinner meal, then that's where it came from. And then if you just keep asking the why questions long enough, it's fun. You think, well, so where did what put the heat in that meat? And what put the heat in that potato? And what put the heat in all that stuff? Well, because eventually, I mean, that's what makes your body run, right? And eventually you start thinking, well, where did all that come from? It comes from those products. Where did they get the heat? You ever thought of that? Where does a potato get heat that it can transfer to a 13-year-old boy wedging his way down in a haystack on a cold winter night waiting for a rabbit? Where did the potato get that heat that now warms that boy? Eventually, if you say, well, that meat, maybe it was a hamburger or a pork chop or something I ate, had the heat in it, and then say, well, then where did that pork chop or that potato get their heat? Well, if you trace everything back, you find out that it all comes from the sun. That sun that shines overhead every day, year round, in different measures at different times of the year. But that's where the heat comes from. And I don't know, I still kind of think of that, me straying off with thoughts like that. And I do even today, because you can trace a whole lot of things back to the sun. The light could be traced to the sun. And what I found out is there's sun with an S-U-N and there's sun with an S-O-N. The one with an S-O-N has a capital S on it. And I'd been taught and believe to this day that he created the heavens, the universe, the earth, and all things that are on it. So when I think of where that heat comes from and that light that made things grow, made it so that pork chop or that beef steak could actually have something to eat, that it all comes from the sun. And so those two words, S-O-N, sun, and S-U-N, sun, with a capital S on the S-O-N, sun, I find myself drifting off to that thought quite often. And not just when I'm on a haystack. But once you kind of acknowledge that, and it makes sense, and especially where you see it supported in Scripture. I could name scriptures right now that talk about it. That point to the fact that I guess I would say that I don't believe that there's an etymological, necessarily a connection. There might be, I don't know. But in my mind, there's a connection, because after all, it seems to go together and gives me what I need to eat, so that when I'm nestled down in a haystack and it's 20 below zero, I can keep warm. So why even think about stuff like that? Well, probably you wouldn't if you were in a crowd. You'd never have time to settle into thoughts like that. But if you're not in a crowd, if you don't have a house built to house so that you can hear your neighbors in the next house, just like they were in the next room, like it said in Isaiah, too close together, like they're experiencing in California now with the fires, just so close together that you get a heavy wind like they have down there, and it just drives the flames through the whole bunch of them. Well, I've kind of gone a long way around to tell you that I value solitude. I value that pumpkin over the velvet cushion, especially if it's crowded. And I would probably be remiss if I didn't encourage you to do something similar, because eventually you'll get to a point where you're not going to be able to think clearly. You can't think clearly when there's just noise and chatter going on all the time, when the TV's constantly going, or a video game, or there's noise in a room. You can't get into that kind of a thought pattern that lets you dig and discern and wedge your way into the secret of things. So that's my 2 bits, and it's similar to what Thoreau said, and I put it to the test, and it works. So I pass it on to you. See if maybe I can encourage you to, especially when you're troubled, but not even then, just then, all the time, because you'll find yourself being less troubled if you spend some time thinking through things. One of the things that I've always told my children and others is, you better think about things long enough so that you can figure this out. Why do good things or bad things, why do bad things happen to good people? There's one for you. Why do bad things happen to good people? And you need to think about that long enough and read and study and do whatever it takes to figure out that you have an answer to that. Because if you don't have an answer to that, you're going to get to the point where you don't believe that God exists. I've heard one of the great physicists, Neil deGrasse Tyson, say, I would believe in God, except that God lets bad things happen to really good people, even innocent people, little innocent people. And a God would never do that because he's all-knowing and all-powerful. So why would he do that? Well, maybe I can take some time and explain my thought processes. But my advice has always been to my children and my grandchildren that they need to, before the fact, before something goes bad and they don't understand, they need to have an answer to the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Now, if you read 2 Nephi chapter 2, again, Lehi's lesson, you'll get some help with that. I've mentioned it in earlier uploads on this YouTube channel. Put some thought into that. There's other places that you can get help too. But you have to understand that bad things, that just because bad things happen to good people doesn't mean there's no God. Just once you get to that point, you got to start all over. And that hill's steep enough to climb, but I don't think you're going to climb it. So that's my 2 bits. That's my wisdom for the day. Pumpkins and velvet cushions and warmth in the top of a haystack while I'm hunting rabbits, and bad things happening to good people, and you name it. We need to be alone. We need solitude. We need quiet time to process some of that. It's a good activity. Even if it's somewhere in Hawaii on the deck with a grandson, you need to be able to process so that you can have some peace. You're not always in turmoil. And that's my goal. That's what I'd like you to be able to do. And Jesus Christ, before he went into Gethsemane, met with his disciples in the upper room and taught them some things. And one of the things he said to them is, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give unto you. Not as the world giveth, give I unto you." But then he added this, "Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." That's a good space to be in. Trust me. Trust the scriptures. Trust him. I love y'all. Enjoy.